Good afternoon and welcome to the Council of State Governments webinar entitled Nuclear Waste Policy, Searching for Solutions. This is part 2 of a 2-part series on nuclear waste. My name is Lisa Hanairo and I'm a program director at CSG's Midwestern office. Joining me in developing the webinar series is my colleague Ann Roberts-Brody, who's a policy analyst in the Southern Legislative Conference. Ann and I want to thank Carrie Abner in CSG's national office, who's managing the logistics for the webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded. We'll post the recording on CSG's Knowledge Center and on the SLC and CSG Midwest websites. We'll make sure everyone who registered receives an email with the links to the recorded webinar. Second, all your phone lines are in listen-only mode. That means that you all can hear us, but we can't hear you. If you wish to ask a question, please use the question pane on your GoToWebinar control panel. You may type in a question at any time during the webinar, and we'll read the questions at the end of the presentation. Finally, I want to give an important disclaimer. The Midwestern and the Eastern offices of CSG receive funding from the U.S. Department of Energy to help us engage states on transportation planning in connection with nuclear waste storage and disposal. We're holding today's webinar to present information that Ann and I have determined to be of potential interest to state government officials. Please note that the views expressed in this webinar are not necessarily the views shared or expressed by any CSG office or by the Department of Energy. Rather, they're intended to serve as a platform for discussion among state government officials and other interested parties. Let's turn now to our search for solutions to the problem of managing our nation's nuclear waste over the long term. This topic is very timely because the Department of Energy recently concluded a series of 8 meetings around the country to get input from the public on ways to improve the process of identifying willing and informed hosts for nuclear waste storage or disposal facilities. Ann and I had the opportunity to attend some of the public meetings, and we felt state officials would benefit from learning more about how the lack of a final disposal solution is affecting the communities and the utilities that have to deal with the indefinite storage of spent nuclear fuel from the nation's power plants. On May 19, part 1 of our webinar series focused on defining the problem. On today's webinar, we'll look at possible solutions, and we're fortunate today to have an excellent panel with us. First, we'll hear from Andrew Griffith. Andrew is the Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fuel Cycle Technologies in the Office of Nuclear Energy at the Department of Energy. He'll discuss the federal government's efforts to identify a solution, specifically the DOE's strategy for consent-based siting of facilities that will be part of an integrated waste management system. Next, we'll hear from 2 speakers about potential private facilities for the consolidated interim storage of nuclear waste. First up will be Betsy Madru, Vice President of Government Affairs for Waste Control Specialists, or WCS. She'll provide an overview of WCS's proposed facility in Andrews County, Texas. And following Betsy will be John Heaton, Vice Chairman of the Eddie Lee Energy Alliance and a former representative from the State Legislative District in New Mexico that is home to DOE's Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, or WIPP, the world's only deep geologic repository for transuranic waste. John will share with us information on a proposed storage facility near the WIPP site. Each speaker will have up to 15 minutes to talk, and we'll take questions when all speakers are done. Remember to type in your questions as we go along. And with that, let's get started. Andy, you have the floor.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. This is Andy Griffith from the Department of Energy, and it's good to be here with you all today on this important topic. Going to slide 2. Let me talk a little bit about the consent-based siting initiative. The goal is to identify a durable solution as we go forward with developing an integrated waste management system. Siting these facilities in a way that involves the community and allows them to act as willing and informed hosts. We think we'll set up the program to endure the decades of challenges that'll face us in the future. So moving forward on this objective, we want to work collaboratively with the public as well as specific stakeholders, governments at all levels of state and local governments, as well as of course tribes. And you know, we really do believe this is the only way we're going to be successful to develop a durable solution, unlike the top-down types of approaches that have been used in the past. Next slide, please. Okay, what are we talking about? We're looking at an integrated system, one that has some flexibility and some resilience to it when things might not go as according to plan. We're talking about the, as Lisa mentioned, interim storage facilities as well as disposal facilities for commercial and defense waste. And linking all these facilities is the all-important transportation function. We're looking at developing a transportation system that is that minimizes the risk of derailments or problems. Clearly, it has to be a safe transportation system, but we also want one that's reliable and dependable. Next slide, please. So the steps that we're in the midst of, we are reaching the end of the first step there, engaging with the public, and moving into the designing of a system, of a process that can be flexible as we go forward. And then using that, moving toward the step 3 there, where we're using that process to become partners with communities, tribes, states, that allows us to build a strong partnership and provide for that durable solution going forward. Next slide, please. So this slide is a very brief history of the past. Clearly, the Blue Ribbon Commission kind of set the stage. The administration strategy takes it into kind of an implementation approach. We had the President's determination and the announcement in March of 2015, which splits out the defense repository as an option that needs to be developed and considered, with the potential of moving waste away from DOE sites sooner than waiting for a commingled repository with both defense and commercial waste. And then in just December 2015, we started this initiative, and as Lisa pointed out, we just wrapped up our 8 public meetings last week. Next slide, please. So the public meetings, I thought, went quite well. They were kind of painful at moments because you know, DOE was obviously criticized by those who do not want us to move forward with finding a solution on waste, and then there were some stakeholders that wanted us to move faster. So we were somewhat in the middle, but I think we designed it that way to get all sides of the discussion. We weren't just looking for people to participate either on our panels or to attend that you know, thought that agreed with our process. We wanted to have a critical look at it, and I think the process that we set up clearly did that. We did get a lot of input, and I'll talk a little bit about what we took away from it. But I would also add that these were very atypical meetings for DOE. Usually DOE has the open mic approach, town hall type of approach. While we did have some of that, I thought the panels that we brought in, the panelists that contributed to the discussion, really enriched the discussion from a range of perspectives, as well as the portion of our meetings that where we broke into small group discussions enabled citizens or participants to view their express their views in a more intimate, you know, discussion type of format, rather than having a mic in front of them speaking to a large audience. And so, you know, we thought that it was very constructive, and we're in the process of digesting the input that we received, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Next slide, please. So this just summarizes where the meetings were, when they were held, and you'll point out that neither Andrews County nor Eddy Lee counties were on the map here, nor will you find Nye County in Las Vegas on the map, and that was quite intentional. We really wanted this to be a national discussion. Clearly, it's a national issue. We wanted to start the discussion at a level that was more policy and strategic oriented, and the last thing we wanted is to presume that we had a solution. Now, granted that the private initiatives that you'll hear from next, they started in parallel with us. and our process was geared toward a federally constructed, federally operated facility. We are looking at the ways that we can engage with the private initiatives in the appropriate way, but you know, it should be noted that they are distinctly different than what we were envisioning for this process. And it certainly is. There's nothing keeping us from engaging with them. It's just a matter of doing it the proper way. While our engagement with communities, tribes, and states on a DOE approach to establishing a waste facility, a disposal or a storage facility, and I think that relationship building, the trust building with those communities is going to be much more organic, certainly unscripted. And we do defer to them to define a lot of the specifics of how they define consent, what type of benefits they would like to have us consider as part of this partnership. I think the relationship with the private initiatives is much more structured in the federal acquisition regulation, so that you know, we're not learning as we go. There's a very disciplined process to compete and to consider proposals and award those contracts, and so that's kind of the distinction between the efforts. But I do want to point out that the private initiatives clearly provide an opportunity for us to move forward faster than we otherwise could have. So moving to the next slide. Additional engagement opportunities in addition to the public meetings. We did participate in a range of professional forums. We were invited to communities in conjunction with our public meetings to have town hall or open meetings in specific communities. For example, we participated in a meeting in Wiscasset, Maine, near Maine Yankee. We also participated in the community engagement panel outside of San Onofre. And those are just a couple examples. But I think going forward, if you or any of your stakeholders have an interest in hosting us for a meeting, or if you're here in Washington and you would like to meet with us, please let us know. We want to have an open dialogue as we go forward. You know, we are looking for a phased and adaptive process that can evolve and improve as we go forward, and a key part of that is keeping those lines of communication open. Next slide, please. What's next? I guess I pretty much covered it. Ultimately, at the end of this fiscal year, just in the middle of September, we are planning on issuing a draft report that summarizes the inputs we received. We're also going to be formulating what steps we would like to take in the upcoming fiscal year to further this discussion. Clearly, I think the next step is to see if we can go to some communities that are willing to host us, or to at least have a conversation with us to consider hosting one of these facilities in the future. And that takes me to the next slide, please. We have in our FY17 budget request about $25 million that we had hoped to award in grants to communities, tribes, and states who would be interested in informing our process and having a discussion with us. Clearly, with the uncertainty of our budget between the House and the Senate, they're quite different. My expectation is that we will get less than we asked for. The question is, will there be any restrictions or additional congressional guidance that either allows us to or prohibits us from going forward with any element of the program? And so with that, I'd like to, you know, just take just note that we're hopeful that Congress will see value in the steps that we've taken, and hopefully we'll be able to continue. Next steps, or next slide, please. So just a brief slide summarizing what we heard. You know, clearly there's a trust deficit out there for the federal government in general, DOE in particular. We are trying to move beyond that, but like the administration strategy indicates, we believe the real solution is to form a separate organization, and we believe it is important that we take the early steps, moving the program in a direction that, while not boxing a future organization into any corners, we want to get things moving in that direction so that hopefully a new organization is formed. Of course, it requires a bill from Congress and the President to sign it to put it in the law, but we believe that's the appropriate step, and hopefully we're supporting any efforts in that direction in the future. Transportation continues to be a major concern, recognizing that consent is not part of the interstate commerce of transportation. However, we want to be sensitive to the views of those along the transportation routes, and so we want to keep that dialogue open and make sure that those along the routes are aware of the steps that we're taking to engage with the states on emergency preparedness, and that we're doing our best to have a safe and reliable system in place for the transportation. Environmental justice is another key point that we've heard. Clearly, we want to engage with communities as equal partners, including all of the communities or subsets of the communities. We don't want to take advantage of any group that's underrepresented or doesn't have the resources, and hence that's one of the main reasons for having the grant to provide them the resources they need to be fully informed. And then the last point there is the shutdown reactor sites. They're looking for a solution, and they would like to see this thing, this program move along sooner rather than later. And so hopefully we've set the stage here to make progress and put the components in place that help build an integrated waste management system, and it's based on a durable siting process. So with that, I'll wrap it up and turn it over to Betsy. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. That was a really good summary of all the work you guys have been up to this past year. Now we'll turn the floor over to Betsy Madru, and a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the questions pane, and we'll get to them after all three speakers are done. Betsy, are you ready?
I'm ready. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. This is Betsy Madru. I am the Vice President of Government Affairs for Waste Control Specialist. WCS is a Texas company. We are headquartered in Dallas, and we currently operate a facility in Andrews County, Texas. So this presentation is specific to our interim storage efforts, but I'll talk a little bit about our existing facility and what we do at the site as well. First slide, please, which is an overview of our project scope. So currently, the project will include for storage of about 40,000 MTUs, built out in 8 separate phases of 5,000 metric tons for each phase, a license for 40 years with up to 20-year renewals. WCS is currently partnered with AREVA and with NAC or NAC International through the licensing process, who will be using their facilities and their existing licenses for storage, canisters, and assemblies that are already being used around the country right now. So we have currently been engaging with DOE and with Congress to talk about our project, and look forward to continuing those discussions. So that's an overview, and now I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics. Next slide. So back in calendar of 2013, WCS laid out admittedly a very aggressive schedule for pursuing a license application and build out to operation for a consolidated interim storage facility. First on the list was to file a notice of intent with the NRC, or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which we did in 15. And the first milestone on that was a license submittal in April of 2016. And as you see in the first bullet point, we submitted that April 28th of this year. So we currently have a license application in-house at the NRC. As I said, it's a WCS license application, but we're partnered with AREVA and with NAC. We've received a request for some supplemental information, and just last week sent our response back with some information, and it looks like we are going to be sending a second round of information into the fall. So we've already begun engaging with the NRC in order to get that license docketed, and once it is, it'll be in Adams and will be accessible as a public document, so you all could have access to it. We've also requested that the NRC begin the environmental impact statement review, which we anticipate to be about 2 years and the longest part of the review process before obtaining a license from the agency. Next slide, please. So this is a list of what systems are currently being used at shutdown sites. And you'll see on the left-hand column, if they're in red, they are a shutdown facility or a stranded facility. Essentially, the only thing that's left is the asphyxia pad at this location or these locations. So on the left, you see the list that have NAC International canisters, and on the right, you see AREVA. On the next page, you see a larger list that includes some additional shutdown sites. Thank you. So you see that both NAC and AREVA have some additional sites that are currently being decommissioned, and then there are other vendors in the marketplace. As you'll hear from Mr. Heaton next, Holtec is a vendor in the marketplace, and Energy Solutions has one cask, which you can see there at Big Rock Point. All right, next slide shows a map of sort of where we are. In the top right corner, you can see the map of Texas. So I like to say we're in the elbow. If you look at the far, far left, we're in that little nook right there. Texas has 254 counties. We're in Andrews County, and our existing location is all the way on the far left-hand side. We actually have about 14,000 acres currently at our site. Some is in New Mexico, most is in Texas. All of our currently licensed facilities that are up and running right now are on the Texas side. This facility would also be on the Texas side. Next page shows you a rendering of the layout that we anticipate for the interim storage facility. As I said, we are looking at 8 phases. So phase 1 on the bottom left corner there. And you can see the guardhouse, and you can actually see the line at the bottom is the rail line coming in and out of the facility. So right now we have an existing rail line. We do receive low-level shipments by rail, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But this would be extending that rail into this new facility, since that's how we anticipate that the used fuel will be coming in. Next slide. The next slide shows you a conceptual drawing of the actual canisters. You'll notice that some of the canisters look different. The intent is that whatever canister is being used at each utility will be able to be used at the WCS Consolidated Interim Storage Facility. So not necessarily a need to reprocess or repackage any of that fuel. However it's being stored at the various sites around the country, it could get into the rail car and move its way to WCS and be stored exactly in the same configuration. So that is our intent. It really is a consolidated storage facility. So we're not trying to move things into different packaging or to make it anything other than just taking the fuel from various places around the country and putting it into one place in Andrews, Texas. So that's why you see the horizontal casks on the left-hand side, those are AREVA, and the vertical casks on the right-hand side of that picture are NAC casks. The next page talks about the environmental characterization. As I said, we are a current existing site. So we have a RECRA landfill. We have a federal landfill that DOE uses. We have a compact landfill that takes low-level radioactive waste from the states of Texas and Vermont and 36 other states that don't have access to a compact waste disposal facility. And we also do storage and processing. So right now we are in operations today. We employ about 180 people out at the site, about 200 total for the entire company. So right next door on the other side of the New Mexico line is Urenco, or LES. So we believe that the environmental characterization of this area has been thoroughly considered, thoroughly reviewed for both our application with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, who is our state regulator here in Texas through the Agreement State Program, and also the NRC through Urenco's facility right next door. Next slide. So as I said, we've already asked the NRC. Last week we asked them to please initiate the EIS process. We anticipate that once our license is docketed, that will be published in the Federal Register, and they will begin stakeholder meetings in the region. We are hoping that one of those meetings is actually out in Andrews County. We find that Andrews is a long way from Austin. Texas is a very big state, and so we think it's important that NRC hear from the people that are in the region that are going to be directly impacted by a facility like this. So after it was published and they received public comment on the project, then a final EIS will be published, and not until that happens could an actual facility be authorized for construction or a license be issued. Next slide talks about rail upgrades. So as I said, WCS already has a full loop around our existing facility. We take low-level shipments right now by rail. Recently, the lines were upgraded. Within the last 2 years, we took some large components, large steam generators that actually were barged down the Mississippi River and came in through the Port of Houston and then by rail over to WCS. And so we think that having the existing infrastructure in addition to having an existing operating facility in Andrews is desirable, and also gives us an opportunity to really work with the NRC for them to actually see what we are currently doing in addition to what we want to expand to do in the future. The next page talks about consent-based licensing. Andy talked about all of the work that DOE has been doing in the various stakeholder meetings. WCS did recently submit a letter to the DOE public comments to be part of the process and to be in the record. We submitted that letter as a joint letter with the Andrews County Economic Development Corporation and the Andrews Chamber of Commerce. We believe that consent should be different in different communities and in different states, and that each one of those states and communities should dictate what consent means to them. So we believe that in Texas, we already have consent. That's how we have been successful to site and operate our low-level facilities for so long. And we see a similar model for an interim storage facility like this. We have encouraged DOE to keep their definition for consent and their findings broad and unique enough that each individual community could access it and could find that it is usable for them. We believe in a bottoms-up approach, which is why we have been working specifically with the local folks. We have briefed our entire state delegation, both congressionally and here at the State House in Texas, but really believe until we can get some relief on what we need from the congressional action or from DOE, that we might not see any changes here on the state side. Which brings me to the next page, which is what does WCS need? WCS has been working with Congressman Conaway and, of course, Congressman Mulvaney. Both have bills in the current legislature that deal with interim storage, and WCS has always needed, they need two things. They need DOE to take title to the fuel. That is part of the WCS business model. We see DOE as the customer, not the utility. And we would need DOE to be able to access money to enter into contracts to pay for the storage. Obviously, WCS is a commercial company or a private company, and so we would be looking to be paid to store this, this spent fuel here in Texas. Now, in Texas, on the low-level side, we have a current model where 10% of the gross receipts go back to the state. And so we would be we would be working with the state of Texas and with our local Andrews County folks to work with them that 5% will go to Andrews County and 5% will go back to the state, which is what's currently there on low level. And we anticipate starting with those numbers as we look at compensating the state and the local community for a project like this. So it's a different model than what is currently out there, or maybe what DOE had currently envisioned, but it's a model that we know has worked in Texas, and so we would be looking to engage with our leaders to start a dialogue to look at a model like that for interim storage. So the next page is really just getting to a summary, almost to the end here, but WCS believes that a large integrated interim storage program would benefit whatever the United States decides to do on a permanent repository. So we've been very cautious and very clear and intentional that we are not competing with Yucca Mountain or with any other permanent repository. The country still needs a permanent repository. This is interim storage. The flip side of that coin is that interim storage is probably 60 to 100 years. And so, you know, most of us will not be here when that fuel moves to another resting place. But we think that open and honest communication with the folks in Andrews and the folks here in Texas is what's important. And so we've been really clear about that, that while this is not a permanent repository, it probably is going to be here for multiple decades. Next slide, please. We also think that by looking at an interim storage or consolidated interim storage facility, wherever that may be, it gives us as a country a chance to work through some of these larger issues, specifically on the transportation piece. It allows for the issuance and the building of new rail cars and the designation of rail routes. And we think that all of that has a benefit to wherever a permanent repository is. So on the last page is a summary, which just sort of encapsulates everything that I've talked about, or at least tried to talk about today. I would encourage you, if you have any more specific questions, WCS does update the WCSstorage.com website. There is a blog on there that our CEO writes and puts out about every 2 weeks or so, and so it's interesting to sort of keep track of, if you're interested in the WCS project specifically, what we're up to, what we're doing, and obviously there's a place on there that you can submit questions if you have things that you'd like to see or you have questions about our proposal in addition to contacting me directly. And that's all I have. And I'll wait to answer questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Betsy. That was really informative. Now we're going to turn to John Heaton. I want to make sure John is audible. John, are you there? It looks like we may have lost the audio for one of our speakers. Carrie, would you and Ann be able to manage the beginning of Q&A while I try to help John get back on the audio?
Absolutely, Lisa. Hi, this is Ann Roberts-Brody with SLC, and we have already received several questions for our first two panelists. And our first question goes to Mr. Griffith. You mentioned that the next phases of this process are contingent on congressional funding, and I think most, if not all of us, have been tuned into the national conventions last week and this week. What are you at DOE doing to brace for an administration change, and do you think that an administration change, regardless of party, will have an impact on the likelihood of that funding coming through?
Yeah, you identify another dynamic in our look forward and the areas of uncertainty of going forward. I mean, that really gets to the heart of my comment that, you know, we really are trying to develop a process that people see value in, a process that doesn't necessarily tailor a technical solution in the near term that might not be very durable in the long term. And so, you know, in recognizing one of the appropriation bills from the one from the House side have us essentially suspending all of these activities and resuming licensing for Yucca Mountain. Again, while that may be an expeditious way of resuming Yucca Mountain, I don't see that approach being successful if the state of Nevada continues to fight us on that, and if Congress continues to limit the access to the waste fund, which has been put aside, which has been accumulated from ratepayers who want us to manage this waste. So there are key elements of the administration strategy that I hope are carried forward in the next administration. But as a career civil servant, that's part of the hand of cards that we're dealt with. That regardless of who wins the election, we need to support the policies that they put in place and the initiatives that they support. And so it's a matter of staying tuned on that. How the House and the Senate reconcile the differences and how they viewed the appropriations for fiscal year 17. Again, we've had communication with both the House and the Senate. I understand that they're working on, there's some work being done on a conference bill, but then again, we're not going to see the results of that until they share it with us. So stay tuned. But I guess let me just add that we are very hopeful. We think what we're doing is heading down a path that can put the pieces in place to manage the spent fuel and high-level waste of our nation. And so we're hopeful that others see the value in this as well.
Thanks so much. And it looks like we do now have John Heaton with us. John, are you there?
I am. I hope you can hear me now.
We can hear you now. Okay,
good. This is John Heaton. I am the chairman of the Eddie Lay Energy Alliance. I'm sorry that we had the difficulty. Next slide. I understand that most of the folks online are legislators, or a lot of them are legislators looking for solutions for spent fuel throughout the country, and I want to welcome you. There are several options for waste solutions. What Betsy just talked about and what I'll talk about in a second is consolidated interim storage. It's clearly the most immediate solution. We think that it can occur within between 4 and 5 years, which in nuclear waste terms is a very short period of time, actually. But we think that we also need access to the Nuclear Waste Fund, which by law restricts it only to a repository, and somehow that legislation needs to occur. There's also the probability of a geologic repository going in. It's really years from reality. In the Blue Ribbon Commission report and in the implementation report, it was indicated it would probably be 2048 before that could potentially occur. WIP also, which is close to where we are, and I should say that our interim storage facility is not on the WIP site. It's not associated with WIP in any way. It's an independent operation, but it is a clear option. What would necessarily have to happen is that there needs to be a change in what's called the Land Withdrawal Act to allow for high-level waste or spent fuel. There are also potentials for technical solutions. Reprocessing, new reactor technology could burn spent fuel. There are a number of those things that are out there, and really make, to some degree, interim storage more sensible than maybe putting it away for a long time. It still has a lot of power left in it, if you will. Next slide, please. So why is consolidated interim storage somewhat urgent? Fuel pools around the country are loaded 4 to 5 times more than they had ever anticipated. Dry cask storage on some of the sites is limited, or in some cases not even available. Some storage is in the most densely populated areas of the United States, even though storage is very, very safe. Some plants have high natural disaster risks. For instance, a couple of plants that are on the fault line in California and other areas of the country, decommissioned plants really do want to get rid of the spent fuel that's only remaining on their sites and create a greenfield. Transportation of spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste has proven to be very, very safe. Sometime, if you're interested, you should look at some of the Sandia presentations. They are very, very convincing. There are thousands of tons that have actually been shipped. Radioactivity decreases rapidly with time, so you get gamma decline as well as heat decline. One of the big issues is the breach of contract that has occurred with DOE was required to take spent fuel in 1998 by contract, and obviously that's not happened. There's no repository any place for them to take it. So the settlement fund, it was estimated in the Blue Ribbon Commission report, will amount to about $20 billion that will go out in payments to the utilities for breach of contract and pay for what expenses they have. This is coming out of the U.S. Treasury. It's not coming out of any other fund. Every taxpayer helping to pay for this. Some estimates are that it will be as high as $26 billion at this point. But after 2020, it's expected to be about $500 million a year until there is a solution, either an interim storage facility or a repository. And finally, it really dispels the arguments that there are no solutions for managing spent nuclear fuel. Next slide, please. So where are we today? I think Betsy mentioned a number of things. In 2015, the Senate tried to pass a comprehensive Blue Ribbon Commission bill, and in 2015, Conway produced a central interim storage bill, but it was killed by Shimkus in the Energy Committee in the Senate. The House, once again in 2016, Mulvaney produced a bill, and again, Shimkus will kill it. In 2016, the Senate is very anxious to have some kind of a bill, and they're working on Senate Bill 854, which is again a comprehensive bill. And we understand that Alexander was very interested in the Senate of producing a central interim storage bill. I haven't seen it, so I'm not, by this time in the year, I'm not sure it will occur. The House is still working on a Yucca bill, but may possibly include central interim storage, but probably very reluctantly. They're highly focused on Yucca Mountain. The House wants Yucca funding, the Senate wants central interim storage, but no Yucca. So there's this conundrum between the two bodies that you all are probably well aware of. So, and as Andy said, NE is embarking on this consent-based process, and DOE is also interested in defense-only repository or some other solution to their defense material. So next slide, please. So DOE is trying to promote consent in a big way. I'm not sure that it's clear what consent is. I think every community, every state will have their own ideas, but it clearly begins with a willing community or a region that's willing to push one of these projects in a heavy way and convince their constituents around the state that it's good for the state, it's good for their area. Knowing what the tentative geology and geography needs to be, and there will probably need to be an agreement by the state itself to host the facility to allow all the geotechnical and environmental assessment issues to go forward that will need to occur. And really the agreement probably is going to depend on the state doing it, and whether it's the governor or whether it's the legislature or who that signs off on that agreement. I think it'll depend on what DOE is saying about it and what they want to do. Next slide, please. So what are the consent options? When you talk about them, you can have a statewide referendum. I think it's very tough. You can have a city-by-city town hall education and consensus process. The legislature could do enabling legislation. the governor could be in the seat where they negotiate and sign. The AG in some states have that ability. Many other approaches are probably viable. Next slide. So some of the things that, you know, I think are important. Somehow, Lisa, I think you've gotten the wrong slide deck. But so, at any rate, next slide, please. This is more of a consent, and I'm sorry for the confusion. Lisa, are you on board? Next slide. Well, really and truly, next slide after this. I apologize. Next slide. So let me just tell you where we are, because this slide deck that she had is the incorrect one, and I apologize for that. But at any rate, we have in New Mexico, our site is located between the lower corner of New Mexico, southeastern corner, and it's right on the border of Texas. And our site is actually between between Carlsbad and Hobbs, which is right on the county line between Eddy and Lee counties. It's 35 miles from any population, whereas when you look at the map that you looked at that you previously saw, you can see that really the affected cities are not really Andrews. Andrews is 37 miles away from the facility. It's communities in New Mexico. It's Eunice, which is 3 miles away, and Hobbs and Jow, which are some 14 or 15 miles away. But at any rate, our location is 35 miles from any population base, and its Holtec's design is one that is subsurface, and it is 30 feet below the surface, and they pour a 3-foot reinforced concrete pad on the bottom, and then they have an array of vaults that are next to each other on that pad. Then they fill the void between the vaults with concrete, and then put again on the top a 3-foot reinforced concrete cap. And then this facility we think is the safest, most secure in the world. We don't think there's anything comparable to it. It has been chosen by San Onofre, which is on the fault line in California. It has the capability of withstanding 1G of force, but because of its low profile, it's not subject to being hit by planes or rockets or any of that sort of thing. And so from that perspective, we think it's extraordinarily safe, and one of the main reasons we chose Holtec as our partner. Just to conclude, we expect to have our license application in sometime around the end of the year, and then it's, as Lisa pointed out, it's a lengthy process going through the NEPA process. It will be 2.5 years to get through that process of hearings and all the other regulatory activities that have to go along. So I apologize for the wrong slide deck being there, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions. Thank you.
John, thank you so much for those excellent remarks, and we have received several more questions since the start of the webinar. And so our first question goes to Betsy. What does WCS believe they have, or I'm sorry, does WCS believe they have a responsibility to seek consent from New Mexico residents near the site? If no, why not?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Well, I think that we, again, anticipate that consent for our interim storage project is no different than receiving consent for our current low-level operations. And we take very seriously the fact that we are on the New Mexico border. We have good relationships with leadership in Eunice, have constant conversations with their community groups and with their county commissioners and their mayor. And we would, again, seek to have that same type of consent that we have for our existing low-level facilities moving forward with an interim storage facility. So we've briefed them a number of times, engaged with them, answered questions, provided information at community meetings, and we would not anticipate that any of that would change moving forward.
Thanks, Betsy. Our next question is actually for both John and Betsy. So after I read the question, John, if you would please answer first, and Betsy, if you would please follow up. The question is, what do you believe is your company's responsibility to engage with corridor states on transportation planning and preparedness?
From Eddie Lee Holtec perspective, we think we have an enormous responsibility. We've been engaged in it with the WIP project here for years, and we went virtually community by community, state by state, doing demonstrations, making explanations, getting everybody along the corridor routes to understand everything about the shipments, about what they included, what the risks were. And there's some very, very good data out there now, and excellent demonstrations that Sandia has done that we would expect to use in the educational process along the way. And of course, it is a major responsibility of DOE to do that.
Thanks, John. Betsy?
Yeah, I agree with John. You know, obviously Texas is next door, and so anything moving towards WIP that comes from the east probably comes through Texas. In Texas, we have a bifurcated regulatory jurisdiction, and by that, I mean that the regulatory agency that we have our license from is not the regulatory agency that is engaged on transportation and routing and also emergency responder training for the WIP routes. And so we've engaged with all of the Texas agencies in order to be responsive to their questions and their inquiries. I have spoken to NTSF. This year I wasn't a panelist and still attended to continue conversations with different governmental entities and just be visible so that we can make sure we're engaged and we understand the concerns of all of the different corridor states as the questioner asked. So, you know, I think that John's right. I think that we also view it as a DOE commitment, and we want to be there to support and help the 180C process in whatever way is appropriate. We know that a facility like this for a commercial company like ours cannot be successful without transportation and without the engagement of states, you know, to move that fuel or that material into a new location.
Thanks so much, Betsy. The next question submitted goes to Andy. Once consent is given, is this a done deal, or can it be taken away? Who makes that decision and how?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like I alluded to in my earlier comments, we believe that consent is largely going to be defined by the community. What do they feel comfortable consenting to? And that's kind of a discussion or a process that has to be gone through before you reach a conclusion. Part of that discussion has to be kind of the timing. At some point in the process, we believe that there should be a legally binding agreement that, provided there are no surprises, or if surprises do come up, that there's a process for addressing them in a collaborative partnership approach, but that at some point that there's a commitment of no turning back unless there are surprises. You know, an example of that might be we agree to go forward and we go forward with the licensing process, for example, but something is uncovered during the licensing process that indicates there's a question about the safety of the facility and the geology where the disposal site is located. If that safety question is not addressed to everyone's satisfaction, particularly the community, then they would have the option of backing away from that agreement, and DOE would have to, if DOE disagree with that, then that would be an option to be tied up in the courts. We hope not to reach that type of scenario, but those would be types of the provisions of such a legally binding agreement. I think in theory, it would be, again, it defaults to, what do the communities feel comfortable committing to as part of their consent.
Thanks so much, Andy. We've got time for one last question, which we will direct to Betsy and to John. This time, Betsy, if you'll go first, and John, if you will follow up. The question is, your project is successful. How specifically would the state government be involved in overseeing the site, and how would states be affected by shipments to the site involved?
You cut out a little bit, but I the gist of the question. I'm going to answer the second part first, which is I would answer it the same way that I answered the last question in terms of transportation and routing and using the 180C process. I think that we have seen that process work for transportation routes that have been designated to move material to WIP, and we would continue to engage with DOE and with states and communities as we worked through that process to transport the material to an interim storage facility, for example, like one in West Texas or in southeastern New Mexico. To answer the first question, I can only speak for what we envision here in Texas, but I think the answer is yes. Technically, the NRC can license these types of facilities and doesn't need state necessarily sign-off or engagement. In Texas, we have 2 current nuclear utilities that have S50 pads that already have Part 72 licenses from the NRC. But we would envision that a project of this nature, and especially when we're asking about consent at a state level, that we would see the state regulatory agency, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, be engaged here in Texas to some degree in not only the licensing but also the operational and the enforcement part of a facility like this. And so those are conversations we've only started to have. We would anticipate that as we move more through the licensing process with the NRC, that we continue to engage the regulator and also folks at the State House about what that looks like and what their desire is to see. But yes, we are anticipating additional oversight at the state level on top of what is required by law by the NRC.
Thanks so much, Betsy. John?
Oh, you broke up asking the question. You're going to have to ask it again.
Absolutely. If your project is successful, how specifically would the state government be involved in overseeing the site? How would the states affected by shipments to the site be involved?
Okay, as far as the state overseeing in a regulatory way, probably to a large degree there would be deferral to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I doubt that many states have a nuclear division that is capable of overseeing these kinds of facilities, and mainly states have RCRA authority, primacy given by EPA, but the reality is that spent fuel will not have any RCRA constituents in it, so it's an issue about radiation, emergency response, all of that sort of thing, which the state will be heavily engaged in. And I would expect that they would want to do joint oversight of the facility when inspections are made by the NRC. I think that this really, I can't think of a division in the state of New Mexico that would really have the IQ, if you will, to do that sort of an inspection and oversight, which clearly should be collaborating, should be in the communication system, that whole series of communication effort that ought to be engaged. As far as transportation goes, that would have to probably be dictated to some degree by the legislature and what they would do with WIP. As an example, we do a full-blown CVSA 7 at the border of the state, and that same sort of approach may be also taken by as the rail system comes into the state. Incidentally, we have BNSF and the site we're in is to some degree in the middle of the potash mining areas, so there is a very sophisticated, robust rail system that is there, so we don't anticipate really any rail whatsoever. So that's essentially how I would see it unfolding.
Thanks so much, John. And that's all the time that we have for today. If you have any additional questions that were not addressed during this webinar, please feel free to send them to myself, Ann Roberts-Brody, or to my colleague, Lisa Hanairo, and we will work with our presenters to get an answer for you. Lisa and I would like to thank our presenters today for their excellent contributions and presentations and for spending an hour of their time with us. We'd also like to thank our CSG colleague, Carrie Abner, for her help with all the technical aspects of this webinar. And of course, we also would like to thank all of you for spending an hour of your afternoon with us. We hope that you found this webinar useful and informative. If there is anything that the Council of State Governments can do to support you and your work, please do not hesitate to contact us. Thanks again, and have a wonderful afternoon.